Hello, friends. So far, I have delivered 3 lectures on general exceptions in the IPC. Today, we shall take sections 90 to 93 of the IPC. What are general exceptions? And what is the importance of general exceptions? So I repeat this slide every time. You go to the previous lectures, you'll find this slide common to all lectures, because this slide is the foundation of exceptions. Basically, section 6 of the IPC clearly says that whichever offense is mentioned in the IPC, and there are 511 sections in the IPC, friends. So whichever offense is mentioned and whatever punishment has been prescribed for whatever offense, all of this is understood to be subject to the general exceptions. So if I have gone and committed a theft, if some or the other general exception applies, then that would be considered as a mitigating factor or even an exonerating factor in the case of my being tried under a charge of theft. Right? So general exceptions don't stand alone. They are always to be seen in the context of an offense. There is an offense with which we are charged, and so there is a general exception which I say, fine, I did commit this offense. I know. But when I committed this offense, there was this general exception which applied to that offense, and so I'm not to blame. Okay, having said that, there is a rider attached by the Evidence Act, section 105. It says that if an accused is going to invoke a general exception, if an accused is going to say, sir, I may be accused of causing grievous hurt or having committed a theft or having broken some other law in the Indian Penal Code, but there is an exception which exonerates me, on the strength of which I should be acquitted, then the burden of proving those circumstances which bear out the exception. In short, the burden of proving the validity of that general exception is not on the prosecution. It is upon the accused. The duty of the prosecution is to prove that the accused committed an offense. But if the accused wants to say that yes, the offense was committed, but it was done in the context of a general exception, then that general exception, whether it applies or not, whether it is backed by evidence or not, has to be proved by the accused. So now we come to the regular sections. This, friends, is a very important section. You see, we have earlier gone through our general exceptions and we have found that usually consent is a very good general exception. If consent is given to some harm, and I'll be repeating those briefly just now in a little while, but if consent has been given, right? If, for example, there is a boxing match and there are 2 boxers, both have consented to the possibility of getting hurt, right? So consent is a very big feature in exceptions, because if in the process of the boxing match, if it is a fair play, nobody is hitting the other below the belt, Queensberry rules are being followed, etc., etc., there is a good referee, there are rounds, the health of both boxers is checked before they enter the competition, etc., etc., so that a flyweight is not fighting a heavyweight or something, then even if a boxer gets hurt, the other boxer who has hurt him will not be charged with an offense, because the boxer who is hurt had given his consent, right? So consent is important. But section 90 says, if the consent has been given under a fear or a misconception, right? If there is somebody standing in front of me and he is having 100 rupees in his hand, and I am saying to it, either you give me 100 rupees or I am going to hit you. So he says, Acha Baba, take it. That is not consent. That is consent given under fear. Right? Or if I am taking that 100 rupees and I am saying, Baba, you give me this 100 rupees, I will double it to 200 rupees. Now that is a misconception. That misconception is there. So consent which is given under fear or misconception is not real consent. So if the consent cannot be a consent, if it has been given under fear of injury or under a misconception of a fact, or it is the consent of a madman or a man who is drunk, provided the madman or the drunk man is actually unable to understand the nature of the consent he is giving and what will be the result of that consent. Okay, so there may be any man who is very drunk, but if he is giving a consent to something, for example, he is giving a consent to the barber to cut his hair, and the scissors nick him here, and he has a little injury here. If he has given the consent when he knew that by somebody is going to cut his hair, the scissors are going to be there, and so the nature of the consent is, okay, cut my hair. Consequence is that it is possible that he may suffer a nick or a hurt. So if he is able to understand the madman or the drunk, then the consent is valid. But if he is so drunk, if he is so thoroughly mad, or if he is a child, in all these three cases, consent cannot be construed as consent. Okay? So we move ahead. So what are the elements of consent? If the consent is given by person under fear of injury, or it is given by a person under misconception of fact, if somebody comes and says to X comes to Y and says, "Bhai, I am your father's brother long lost. I am a real uncle of yours." And he says, "This is my photo with your father," or whatever. And he says, "Give me 1,000 rupees." Whereas he is not actually the uncle. And the Y gives to X 1,000 rupees, it is under misconception of the fact that X is his uncle. So there is no consent to the giving of the 1,000 rupees. If the consent is given by a person of unsound mind or under intoxication, who, as I said, should be unable to understand the nature and consequence of that to which they have consented. But there is a second part to this section, friends, which is a very important part, and this I will just show you. This part says, the first part is on the person who is suffering, who gives the consent. Now, what about the person who takes the consent? He should also know that the consent which has been given to me, the man who is committing the offense, he should also know, or he should have reason to believe that the consent being given to me is due to either fear or misconception. Now imagine, a very strong, solid, Dada-like person is standing in the market with a donation box in his hand. Okay. Now, some people are going by and he stops somebody and says, "Bhai, please give me 100 rupees or 500 rupees for Red Cross. Now, the person giving the 500 rupees may think that if I don't give the 500 rupees, this huge man is going to hit me. Right? So he does it out of fear. But the huge man has no idea that he is striking fear into the donor. He is routinely asking. So he does not know. He does not have reason to believe that he is caring the person from whom he is asking the money. Therefore, in such a case also the consent is valid consent, even though the donor has given it under fear. Am I clear, friends? I'm sure I am clear. Thank you very much. So we go ahead. All right. Now, there's a famous case of Dilip Singh versus Dilip Singh alias Dilip Kumar versus State of Bihar. And what does it say? It says, it clarifies that consent portion. The Supreme Court said in 2005, it said it very clear that unless the accused has knowledge or has reason to believe that the consent was given because of fear of injury or misconception, then also the consent is valid. So the requirement of section 20 is in 90. Sorry, the requirement of section 90 is in two parts, right? Two parts. The first part is the consent should not be given out of fear or injury, fear of injury or misconception. The second part is the person taking the consent should have the knowledge or reason to believe that the consent is being obtained by causing fear or causing a misconception. Both the parts have to come together. As the Supreme Court said, they have to be cumulatively satisfied. Unless both parts come together and both grounds are met, consent given out of fear or misconception and consent taken with the knowledge that or having reason to believe that either fear or misconception is being induced, they both should come together. Then and then alone is a consent invalid. Then and then alone is consent not a valid defense. Okay. However, there is a section of the Evidence Act which you must remember. If a woman brings a charge of rape against somebody and sexual intercourse is proved, now whether the woman gave consent or not, whether it was consensual sex or not, the woman who says she was raped, if she tells the court that I did not consent, the court shall presume that she did not consent. There is a variation to it because you, my friends, will be practicing law. There may be 100 instances of consensual sex where both parties agreed. But on the 101st time, the woman may claim she said no. The entire previous 100 cases get wiped out in law. They are of no merit, they are of no relevance in a case of rape. Because the 101st time she says she did not consent. And unless you can prove to the contrary, unless the accused can prove to the contrary, the court shall presume that the prosecutrix, the lady who has filed the complaint, she did not consent. This is a special aspect of the law which we must all remember, and it came about because of the enormous indignities, violence and suffering which women have to undergo, apart from the victimization and social ostracism, ostracization. So it's a very important section. Whether the entire law of consent may operate differently, but here the law of consent changes color. Right? Next. Now, section 91. It says, even if there was a consent to a certain act, but if the basic act committed is an offense, if the act committed itself is an offense under the penal code separately. Okay. For example, as I said, if man is asking for donation on the footpath, another man comes, X and Y, X asking for donation, Y comes and gives the donation. That is explained. But if X says to Y, you give me this money so that I can put it on matka, illegal gambling. So two things have happened here. One, Y has given to X money with consent, and the knowledge of X that he is taking consent. So it's consent. So he has not extorted money from Y. So that is okay. Consent is okay there. But there is an independent offense, the offense of gambling. Right? And because there is an offense of gambling, That is an act which is an offense independently of the harm caused. Okay. So it says very clearly that there are exceptions in section 87. Is a boxing match, which I told you. If in the boxing match, you are going to fix the match fixing, that bhaiya, one chap will, fall down in round 4. That is an independent offense. So even if both boxers have consented to do the boxing, if there is one of the boxers is prepared to fall down or suffer a knockout for extra money, that is an independent offense. 88. Surgery by a doctor. Now, surgery by a doctor is by consent, but in the illustration, you will find a very interesting thing. It says that causing miscarriage may not be an offense at any stage. But if the miscarriage itself is illegal, suppose the doctor had to perform an operation on a woman's gallbladder, right? Or he had to do an abortion, right? And doing an abortion, he also removes a kidney. The consent was for the abortion, not for the removal of the kidney, right? So, 89, consent by guardian. Again, the guardian may consent to something specific, but if the act itself is an offense, irrespective of what the harm is caused between themselves, between the accuser and the accused, the act itself is an offense, right? Then there is no consent. Consent will not be a protection. Suppose a guardian gives consent, ki bhai, you can take my child, my daughter, to place X. Fine. But if that place X is a place where child abuse goes on, and both father and the person who took the child knew that there is child abuse there, so taking of the child may not be an offense because father or guardian consented and the person took. So there's no kidnapping, there's no offense. But independently, the child was supposed to be taken to a place where children are abused. That's an independent offense. So that will not save. That is not saved by this consent provision. So we go on. Now sometimes an act can be done in good faith for the benefit of a person even without consent. Good faith. There may be circumstances when a person is incapable of giving consent and there is no guardian also. All right. So in that case, what will happen? If it is done in good faith and there is no guardian. For example, you find a child moving around on the road, crying and calling for parents, his parents, and you try to ask him or something, he is not able to furnish any details. So what do you do so that he may not die of hunger or suffer or may not catch a cold or whatever? You take him home and you inform the police that such and such a child is in my custody because he could have suffered great harm. So you have not committed the offense of kidnapping, because if you had left him there, he may have been taken away by child lifters. He may have met with an accident. Anything bad could have happened to him. Any harm could have happened to the little child who was forlorn, desolate, looking for his parents but not knowing where they are. So in good faith, even without the consent of the child's guardian, you took the child home, fed the child, whatever. You took care of the child and informed the police. You have not committed the offense of kidnapping. So you may do harm. You may have technically, notionally kidnapped the child, right? But this harm is overcome by the fact that it was done in good faith, even without the consent of the guardian, because it was impossible to obtain the consent of the guardian at that point. The child cannot give consent as per law. Child cannot give consent, guardian was not around. So in the best interest of the child, you took the child home. So act done in good faith for the benefit of a person without consent. So there are some provisions. Consent, even if it is there, even if consent is implied, you have not been able to take consent because there's nobody to give consent, but you have done it to prevent harm, fine. But this exception does not extend to intentionally causing death or attempting to cause death. It does not intend to doing anything which you know is likely to cause death or likely to cause grievous hurt or grievous disease or some infirmity. That is a major problem. Okay. You see a person is about to dangle from a rope, about to commit suicide. Right. What you do is you kick out the stool from under him. And then you say, sir, I kicked off the stool because he was trying to commit a suicide. Arey Baba, by kicking off the stool, he died. And you should have known while kicking the stool that this would inevitably lead to death or to very grievous hurt. The third provision is, if the act you are doing causes hurt or attempts to cause hurt, it should be done only for a purpose of preventing of death or hurt. Okay. Now you see somebody who has held a gun to another person's head and is saying, empty your wallet, empty your purse just now, otherwise I will shoot you. It is going to be imminently this thing. You also have a gun, you are passing by, you see this, you shoot him in the leg. You have voluntarily caused hurt, right? But why did you do it? You were doing it to prevent the death or hurt of somebody else. No consent involved. You did not take anybody's consent. So, but you can cause hurt, but it cannot be for any reason other than preventing death or hurt. Fourthly, of course, abetment of these actions is also an offense. That is okay. So if any action which violates these provisos is done, that is an offense. And if I'm standing by the side of the accused and I'm helping him to do that, I'm abetting the offense. So this exception of consent cannot extend to abetment either. For examples, I'll give you some examples of this. There is a horse rider who is riding a horse. Suddenly, while trying to jump a ditch or something, the horse throws off the rider and the rider lands in a ditch and his head strikes a stone or something. Now, you as a brain surgeon know that unless his skull is cut immediately and some clot which has formed is removed forthwith, the poor chap will not survive. And there is nobody around. Just the chap who is fallen down and is unconscious, and you and your clinic nearby. So there is an emergency. Unless you run a test and you find there's a clot probably. So unless you perform that cutting the skull surgery immediately, that man could die. So you don't wait for his relatives to come or somebody else to come and to give you consent. You say, Baba, let me save. So you have caused hurt, but only in order to prevent grievous hurt or death. Now imagine another situation. You and your friend have gone hunting the tiger. Abhi nahi karna, it is against the law, but it's an example. You and your friend have gone to hunt a tiger. And then suddenly in the bushes, the tiger jumps and catches hold of your friend. You have a gun. Now you know that if you shoot the tiger, will your friend escape. But you also know that if you shoot, your friend may also get hit. On the spur of the moment, you decide that it is better to try and kill the tiger and taking the risk of your friend getting hurt rather than not doing anything. Perfectly valid. Preventing greater hurt or greater harm. right? Similarly, there is an accident. Okay. Now in this car accident, now you are passing by and you are your doctor, and there is somebody else. There's some hospital nearby where you're working, or after the accident, the person is immediately brought to your hospital. When you see the person, you know that some surgery is absolutely essential, right? There's a major gash here in the stomach, suppose, and the intestines are hanging out. And unless you push in the intestines, do something to his system, stitch up everything again, the chap will not survive. At that time, it's a crisis. You don't wait for permission. You don't try to locate his guardian or whatever, person authorized to give permission on his behalf. He himself, of course, is unconscious, poor chap. So what do? You perform the surgery. Here also, you have acted not to cause grievous hurt, but to prevent grievous hurt or harm. And if in the process he even dies because of some unrelated causes which could not be diagnosed, you are not to blame. Now, the last example. A tall building is on fire, right? The fire brigade is not arrived. You are up there on the say 8th floor, and there's a little child who is caught in the smoke is coming in. The smoke is billowing, and the fire is licking at the door. You know maybe that if you slide down that pipe, sewage pipe or shaft pipe, maybe you are maybe not survive. For the child, what the people have done on the ground, they have spread out a huge soft blanket, so that if the child is thrown from the window, he will land on the blanket. You have no choice to prevent the death of the child from asphyxiation or burns. You throw the child from the window so that he lands on the blanket. 99% nothing will happen to him, but in 1% he may suffer a concussion or some other problem, or something inside him may get jolted. You did not take consent from him because he's a child, he cannot give. There was no guardian around. You were there by chance, you saw the room, you yourself were thinking of coming out by the shaft, but the child could not, you could not carry the child with you, so you pick him up and throw him into the blanket, which is being held by 15% downstairs, only to catch somebody like the child. You are not to blame for any incidental consequences which the child may suffer on account of your rescue effort. Now, the last section is section 93. No communication made in good faith is an offense by reason of any harm it may cause to the person to whom it is made, if it is for the benefit of that person. This is very common. Somebody is diagnosed with some disease, and the disease is such that, try as anyone might, the patient is not likely to survive beyond a certain period of time. Now, it is the duty of the surgeon to, in good faith, tell such a patient that, look, you are suffering from such and such a disease. We will try our best to control or manage it. But normal circumstances, the lifespan for those who have such a disease is reduced considerably, and usually it is reduced to, say, 1 year or 3 years or 4 years, whatever. That is the duty as a surgeon to tell him. But the man is weak of heart. And the moment he hears this, he dies. He gets such a shock, he gets a heart attack. Now, is the surgeon to blame? No. Because in good faith, he has communicated what he should have communicated. And it was the benefit of the man. If he had to make a will, if he had to travel somewhere, if he had important work to do in the next 3-4 years, if he had children to get married, whatever, he could plan those activities accordingly. So in good faith, the surgeon told him these things. But the man was so shocked, he collapsed. Is the surgeon to blame? No. The communication made in good faith for the benefit of the person to whom the communication is made protects the communicator, the maker of that communication, from any adverse consequences. Thank you very much, friends. We shall move to the next few sections in our next lecture next week. Thank you.